Okay, so gotta share this today. Lesson 66 from the Course in Miracles, which is my happiness and my function are one. And I have to laugh about it because obviously I'm focusing and asking on, well, what is happiness? And how do you get happy? And at the same time, I kind of came back to studying this material. Obviously, there's a different perspective and all these different things I'm studying. I'm looking around because I have books everywhere. And then I came back to this and have been adding this, and I have to laugh because I didn't realize it was so focused on happiness when I studied it before. And then it's very explicitly stating what happiness is, right? Happiness and my function are one. So let's see what it says. You've surely noticed an emphasis throughout our recent lessons on the connection between fulfilling your function and achieving happiness. And yes, I have. I never noticed it before, hilariously, until I started asking these questions. But just as a quick review, it says the last few lessons have said, I am the light of the world, and that forgiveness is my function as the light of the world. And it does speak into this making you happy. So it says, my happiness and my function of forgiveness basically are one. This is because you do not really see the connection. Yet there is more than just a connection between them. They are the same. Their forms are different, but their content is completely one. The ego does constant battle with the Holy Spirit on the fundamental question of what your function is. So in this course, the ego is really your physically focused self, and the Holy Spirit would be your non-physically focused self, if you were going to use it in the terms of what Abraham teaches, but basically that your mind's a bit split. The ego is the part of you that thinks it's a body, that thinks it can die. Really, if you study any kind of Buddhism or Alan Watts, when they're referring to the ego, it's very similar. It's the piece of you that thinks you're separate and apart from everything else. So, and the Holy Spirit, like I said, would be like the non-physically focused part of you, or the sort of supreme holy version that knows all the truth, your spiritual mind versus your natural mind in Neville Goddard's terminology. So does it do constant battle with the Holy Spirit about what your happiness is. It is not a two-way battle. The ego attacks and the Holy Spirit does not respond. He knows what your function is. He knows that it is your happiness. Today we will try to go past this wholly meaningless battle and arrive at the truth about your function. We will not engage in senseless arguments about what it is. We will not become hopelessly involved in defining happiness and determining the means for achieving it. Oh, I would never do that. That's like all I've been doing. What is happiness? Why is it fleeting? How do you get there? That's funny. We will not indulge the ego by listening to its attacks on truth. We will merely be glad that we can find out what truth is. Our longer practice period today has as its purpose your acceptance of the fact that not only is there a very real connection between the function God gave you and your happiness, but that they are actually identical. God gives you only happiness. Therefore, the function he gave you must be happiness, even if it appears to be different. Today's exercises are an attempt to go beyond these differences in appearance and recognize a common content where it exists in truth. And it's funny, it says God gives only happiness, because anyone I feel like that throws around the term God a lot and believes in it, they're not very happy, and they don't ever talk about the importance of happiness or God giving happiness. And I feel like it begs that constant question for some faiths. They're like, how could God let this happen? And they're like, well, we just don't understand, but there's something else going on. Begin the 10 to 15 minute practice period by reviewing these thoughts. God gives me only happiness. He has given my function to me. Therefore, my function must be happiness. Try to see the logic in this sequence, even if you do not yet accept the conclusion. It is only if the first two thoughts are wrong that the conclusion would be false. Let me repeat. God gives me only happiness. He has given my function to me. Therefore, my function must be happiness. And by the way, this course, like if God gives only happiness, obviously a lot of us have experienced things other than happiness in this life. So it tells you something is off. Let us then think about the premises for a while as we are practicing. The first premise is that God gives you only happiness. This could be false, of course, but in order for it to be false, it's necessary to define God as something he is not. Love cannot give evil, and what is not happiness is evil. Now that's fascinating because, again, the people I feel that I talk about God a lot and know, this, they do say that God is an all-loving God, and it's always been this very curious thing. If it's an all-loving God, why do all these terrible things happen? And a lot of them aren't that happy, being blunt. So it's fascinating to me when it says, love cannot give evil, and what is not happiness is evil. I have to say, I feel like if people knew that what is not happiness is evil, they wouldn't view happiness as so frivolous or sort of a miserable life or a lot of sacrifices as a good thing. It's almost like there's this penance and this sacrifice energy that, like, it's okay because we're going to somewhere good. But if we knew that anything that wasn't generating happiness was evil, I think there would be a lot bigger of a push to be happy, right? God cannot give what he does not have, and he cannot have what he is not. Unless God gives you only happiness, he must be evil. And that's so logical, because that's, again, people's biggest beef with a lot of religion is saying, well, how could a loving God create this? And it's a good question. He would be a jerk if he did. And we're often stuck in these two ideas of this world. There's the sort of the ceramic model and the mechanistic model, or what Alan Watts calls them. And one is like, it's all pointless and nobody created it and it's just all a goof, which doesn't make a lot of sense if we're honest with ourselves. And then there's this idea that a God made it and he's always in charge and managing everything. But that doesn't make sense for this exact point, because if he was a part of all this, there would be a piece of him that's evil. And we often miss like a third possibility that, well, we created the world, or something's off in this world. Like maybe there is a loving God, but it's not what's happening here. And that's what this course gets at. This course gets at a third option where we made this world, or the ego and the world of bodies and separation, because we're powerful creators and we create with our minds and our minds create reality. We were able to essentially create a world that was sort of in place of the world God made for us, which isn't so awesome all the time. And we don't realize we're such powerful creators, and we don't realize that it's sort of a dream we created. And a lot of faiths talk about it being a dream, Hinduism, Buddhism. And if you think about it all being vibration, which we've established scientifically, it would make sense that it's a dream, because it's kind of not real. Like even here I look real, but we know I'm mostly space. That doesn't make a lot of logical sense, which you think would cause a lot more people to question, isn't it a dream? And if it is a dream, well, then it would make a lot of sense that I'm directing what's happening, because I always do in my own dreams. And it's always emanating from our own mind. And so if that were the case, then it would make a lot of sense that my mind creates the reality here. All right, that was a tangent. Forgive me, I'm back. Okay, unless God gives you only happiness, he must be evil. And I like how honest that is, because if you're telling me that I've got a loving God here who's made this world and a lot of terrible things are happening, then he's a jerk, essentially. He's not an all-loving, caring God. And it is this definition of him you are believing if you do not accept the first premise, that God gives me only happiness. The second premise is that God has given you your function. We have seen that there are only two parts of your mind. One is ruled by the ego and is made up of illusions, or the dream. The other is the home of the Holy Spirit, or your inner being if you study Abraham, or your non-physical focused self, and it says where truth abides. There are no other guides but these to choose between, and no other outcomes possible as a result of your choice but the fear that the ego always engenders, and the love that the Holy Spirit always offers to replace it. And it's a great time just to point back to the emotional scale, which is fascinating because fear is all the way down here. So I was playing with my lilies, and so I got lily pollen all over my hands, and it looks like I got some kind of disease. Okay, so fear is down here at the lowest part of the vibrational scale, and what's at the top? Love. So essentially you're saying that fear is down here, which would be of the ego, the world of bodies, sort of this lower vibrational state, and that love, which is of your inner being, or the Holy Spirit, where God and all the good stuff abides, healing and everything else that we want, would be at the top. I find it fascinating that this is obviously not connected with this, but that's what Abraham is constantly teaching, is that you want to get up on the vibrational scale, and essentially, because that's where you connect with your inner being, which would support this, that's saying that's where the Holy Spirit abides, in that part of your mind. It's a vibrational game, and it depends how we're feeling. Okay, there are no other guides but these to choose between, and no other outcomes possible as a result of your choice but the fear that the ego always engenders and the love that the Holy Spirit always offers to replace it. Thus, it must be that your function is established by God through his voice, capitalized, that means your Holy Spirit, or is made by the ego, which you have made to replace him. And this will get at that we made sort of the ego in the world of bodies. Which is true. Unless God gave your function to you, it must be the gift of the ego. Does the ego really have gifts to give, being itself an illusion and offering only the illusion of gifts? And the illusion of gifts of the ego would be money, stuff, being pretty, being, and any of that type of stuff, because it's all an illusion in the sense because it always passes. You can't take it with you. It's always temporary. Think about this during the longer practice period today. Think also about the many forms the illusion of your function has taken in your mind and the many ways in which you tried to find salvation under the ego's guidance. Did you find it? Were you happy? Did they bring you peace? We need great honesty today. Well, I got a lot of things that looked really good in the eyes of the world, and I can tell you, it didn't make me happy. I couldn't figure out why, because I really thought it should. I checked all the boxes, but I could feel it wasn't real in a way, I guess. And in my case, it really wasn't. In many ways, it was an illusion, but yet it wasn't. But it felt like an illusion to me, I'm seeing. And I think that's because of this, being called to this work, because it isn't real. I mean, even if you have a great job or lots of money and, all of these things, it is passing. It doesn't feel substantial even when you have it. And that's what made me ask for more. I want real happiness. Did they bring you peace? No, I felt a great deal of unpeace then, actually. We need great honesty today. Remember the outcomes fairly and consider also whether it was ever reasonable to expect happiness from anything the ego ever proposed. And I'm not saying it's wrong to have that stuff, by the way, but let me be clear that I got all that stuff as an aim to be happy. And I can see now that I got it in a way as a sense of things that were going to make me happy. And so it was following the call of ego to say, hey, you're telling me these things are going to make me happy. I'm going to follow it. And then I got there and it definitely didn't work. Yet the ego is the only alternative to the Holy Spirit's voice. This book makes it simple. There's only ever two choices in this course of study. You will listen to madness or hear the truth. Try to make this choice as you think about the premises on which our conclusion rests. We can share in this conclusion, but in no other, for God himself shares it with us. Today's idea is another giant stride in the perception of the same as the same, and the different as the different. On one side stand all illusions. All truth stands on the other. Let us try to realize that only the truth is true. So funny. In the shorter practice periods, which would be most helpful today if undertaken twice an hour, this form of the application is suggested. My happiness and my function are one because God has given me both. It will not take more than a minute and probably less to repeat these words slowly and think about them a little while as you say them. And, for some folks that can be resistant to the idea of God, this can be a little wordy or a little heavy on that point, but this isn't a religious text at all. It's much more metaphysical, and it actually goes along very well with any type of metaphysical study, be it Buddhism or Alan Watts or Abraham or Taoism or Hinduism or any type of sort of modern spiritual thought process around positive thinking or Neville Goddard or any of the stuff basically that I've got going on. It's really, but here again is a different concept of God than we've ever heard of. And again, it's addressing sort of this alternate idea of how the world came to be that's kind of pointed at in the Garden of Eden, but is gotten really misunderstood, which is, that basically there was this beautiful place created, something different, and then something happened. And in this course of study, it's that we created the world of bodies, sort of, and the ego and split ourselves and put ourselves to sleep. And anyway, I find it fascinating. The general writer of this book is believed to be Jesus. It came to some folks, they were actually, I think, the head of the psychiatry, or at least very heavily involved, or worked for the psychiatry school at Columbia, actually, and were very dissatisfied with the methods they were using to try to heal people. Two of them, one specifically walked away, and a woman, I think, stepped away with him. And they decided to ask and look for something else that could treat people and would help people. And I think she started to get all these weird symbols in her head and like all this stuff, and she started to just write it down. It sort of became this tome, which I guess would be the way any holy book would probably come to be. But there are pieces in here where it sounds like it's sort of Jesus talking, and talking a lot about how his story is really misunderstood and what he did and who he was. And I do love Neville Goddard's take a lot on how the Bible is much more metaphysical journey, mental journey, than it is a literal story to be followed. And that Jesus was sort of the first person to kind of get there and wake up and realize the truth of the dream. And that's how he was able to override the usual rules of the dream, or at least of the ego. And that's sort of what this is all about. And I do dig, super dig, forgiveness. I am realizing the power of forgiveness more and more, and that it feels good to forgive and let it go. Now, did I know that it was going to bring me happiness and be my function? Well, I guess I know in some ways that not being resentful and forgiving brings happiness. I've walked a bit of that journey, but not at this level. And this gets pretty intense with it of why forgiveness and the level of forgiveness is affecting our minds and creating our sort of dream and projecting it out. It gets pretty deep into that. But anyway, and the study of happiness, I think it's a pretty key thing to throw in, because it's saying that my happiness is a result of forgiveness. And the more I forgive, the happier I'm going to become. And that's a nice road, because it can be easy to get resentful and feel like the world's going to hell in a handbasket and all these things that can be more negative. And it's one reason I gravitate a lot to Abraham's teachings, because they're so positive and so focused on positivity. And really, I thought it was a bit in conflict with this, but more and more I'm realizing that they're actually really in alignment. You're talking about love being the best thing, and happiness is the goal of my creator, which is a creator I can get a lot more enrolled in than the one that I was sort of sold for a while, because it didn't make sense. And I appreciate this book so much because it addresses that directly and says in many places that we believe that hate and love can exist in the same place, and we believe that God can be an all-loving God and also cruel, and that's not possible. So, anywho, that concludes that.